Well guys, thanks for the intro. Thanks Marco for the invite today. Pleasure to come and speak. And Chris, thanks for that. Where's he gone? Brilliant presentation there. Obviously massive shoes to fill. Very scientific. It blows mine out of the water in terms of the research and the statistical side of things. I'm probably going to come at it from a little bit more of an applied perspective today. Try to use some latest research and some evidence to back up some of the sort of things that I'm putting into the presentation and things that we currently do at Millwall, and how we sort of apply that within sort of the prevention process, but also the rehabilitation process as well. Also got my colleague here, Dave Caroline, today to support me, so kindly come along, mate, and sort of credit him for some of the information and some of the data that's gone into these slides. He's a bit of a guru with that, so cheers for that, mate. Much appreciated. So yeah, like I said, most of the presentation is going to focus on sort of the rehabilitation process and how we can utilise GPS to optimise that process and hopefully get a successful return to play or return to training following injury. Prior to that, just a little bit of background, looking at sort of injury risk factors and how we can mitigate or minimise some of those modifiable risk factors that may contribute to a player or an athlete getting injured alongside sort of training load and GPS monitoring. Okay, so yeah, just a little bit of, I'm a bit careful now, I don't read off the slides because I don't want Chris to batter me afterwards, but I sort of put these together over the last few days, so I'm sort of running through it myself as we go. But yeah, first of all, so we're going to just have a little review of some of the potential injury risk factors, modifiable and non-modifiable, and look at which ones that we can actually affect as practitioners and trying to minimise the risk of injury. Sort of more relationship to the presentation is looking at sort of training load, and so what some of the research is saying about sort of different metrics and how certain physiological loads can increase the risk of injury or decrease the risk of injury, and what those key metrics are that are in the research, but also that we use and implement at Millwall as well. And then looking at possible risk factors, causations of injury, and again how we can modify or mitigate those risks, and then almost working backwards from an injury to end stage rehab. So what are some of the return to training, return to play markers that we're looking to achieve from a GPS point of view. I'll cover some of the gym markers as well that we use in combination, but that's not the primary focus, but we'll sort of touch on those alongside that. And then also how to actually then design and implement a structured sort of periodised rehab plan within the process and how that relates to sort of previous training load as well. And then just at the end, just a little case study of an injury that we've worked with this season, of a hamstring injury, and how that looked like from a planning and periodisation point of view for a successful return. So first thing is, obviously again, a bit mindful I'm reading off the slide here, but obviously loads of information on this slide, so I won't read through it all. But obviously with any injury, we have to understand there are multiple risk factors, and most injuries are multifactorial. So training load is just one aspect that we're going to focus on today. But when you're rehabbing or putting a plan together, there's lots of other things you need to factor in to your rehab plan or your process. So obviously we've got modifiable risk factors, non-modifiable risk factors in there, and then internal and external risk factors. So I'm not going to read through all those, but there's loads of factors in there that we need to consider in regards to why an injury may have happened, but also in the rehab process of can we modify any of these factors to help get successful outcomes. So some of the key ones here, so the non-modifiable ones we're looking at are, as we know from the research, previous injury, so players or athletes with previous hamstring injuries or muscle injuries, a significantly higher risk of a secondary or re-injury. Age being a big factor as well, so we know older players or athletes, particularly over 30, higher risk, but also potentially younger athletes or players coming through from academy, stepping up to first team. Obviously those change in training and match demands increase that risk of injury. Gender being another one, we know that female players or athletes may be more predisposed to certain types of injuries, ACLs, things like that, for example, due to biomechanics. So they're things that we can't really change within the rehab process. So we have to be aware of those, and they may factor in, but we can't change those. And then more importantly, the modifiable risk factors here that we need to consider and can we modify. So if any injury, we know that fitness level is a high correlation. So players with a low chronic load or low fitness levels, potentially higher risk. So is that something we can improve prior to injury? Or if a player does get injured, then is that something we need to consider before returning to training? For all these other factors from an S&C or sort of performance coach point of view that we try and improve for injury, so strength being a key one. So for example, hamstring injuries, we know players with weak eccentric hamstring strength, basically we test them on a NOR board, Generally, the guidelines say, I think it's about 400 newtons, but more specifically relative to body weight. So if they're lacking eccentric strength, is that a component of why they've got injured? Stability, biomechanics, stability, and then obviously other psychosocial factors within that as well. So from a rehab point of view, when we're sort of getting a player back from injury, these are a lot of factors we need to take in consideration. Again, just this slide to highlight that injuries don't just happen because of training load. Training load is a big factor and one that we can manipulate or affect. But like I said, you've got all these other intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors potentially related that ultimately cause the injury. Okay, so just a little look at the research there. So again, just a little bit of lit review before I put this sort of slide together, and looked at what some of the latest research is looking at in regards to training load per se and certain metrics and how that can relate to injury. So we know that muscle injuries account for about anywhere between 20 to 37% of time loss injuries in football. Most common injuries, overuse lower limb, particularly hamstrings, quads and groins. And that was a study in young football players. And that we know, looking at certain GPS metrics, that there is a high correlation between load and injury. So whether that's too much load or not enough load, and trying to find that sort of perfect balance really. And then a couple of other studies we've looked at here. So this one looked at players performing significantly higher meters per minute in the weeks preceding injury. So increasing training intensity or density, increased risk of injury. And then another study here looking at a 3-week sort of loading in pre-season in terms of sprint distance and high-speed running distance, and then the increased risk of injury in Australian footballers. And also high number of accelerations over a 3-week period. So what we can see by the research is that there's loads of different metrics we're collecting through the GPS, and there's not one key predictor here in terms of high-speed running, accelerations, decelerations, distance per minute. There's multiple factors, and a significant change in load overall with any one of these or multiple of these factors could increase the risk of injury. So I think when we're analysing, for example, when an injury's happened, why it's happened, there's multiple things we need to look at here and factor in. So essentially, all this data we know from the research, all these risk factors, is a little bit of a minefield when we're looking at why an injury's happened and then how we need to sort of plan the rehab process. Like I said, often multifactorial in nature, result in large increase in acute loads. So for those into your acute chronic ratios, if we see a spike or a significant increase in one of those metrics, in my experience, explosive distance, high-speed running and sprint distance are quite key within that, and that's something we'll look at in a little bit more detail. But if you can build good chronic load in your athletes or your players over time, nice and progressive, which will come down to your sort of periodisation model, can we minimise the risk of injuries happening? Like I said, there's a huge number of metrics now, so through the GPS data we collect, there's hundreds of metrics we can look at, so it's trying to focus on which ones are the most relevant and specific to what we're trying to achieve, and which ones are most relevant to either risking injury or minimising risk of injury, and how effective is acute chronic ratios in terms of identifying risk of injury to players, and is there actually a sweet spot we can find for each player, or is that very individualised, and is that constant, or is that evolving all the time? So some of the key metrics that we're looking at in particular and that are evident within the research. So key one here, total distance is quite obvious, how much distance the player's covering either within a session or across a period of time. Distance per minute is always an interesting one, and like I said, a little reference in the research there to looking at sort of distance per minute, changes in that and the increased risk of injury, so a spike or increased intensity in training. Obvious ones that you're probably all familiar with, high-speed running, sprint, explosive distance. So explosive distance being sort of number of high-intensity accelerations and decelerations, which obviously put a lot of load, eccentric actions into the muscle, quite fatiguing, quite metabolically demanding actions. Again, seeing a high correlation with that, spikes in explosive distance, subsequent soft tissue injury. Another key one is here, again, as part of your rehab as well, is looking at relative to each player, what sort of speeds do they achieve within training and games? How often do they get to those speeds? And so how do we need to replicate that or build them back up to that within the rehab process? And then another interesting one, obviously Dave brought in, that we're looking at quite key at the moment is the actual magnitude of accelerations and decelerations. So not just how many they're doing, but what sort of intensities they get up to within those acceleration and deceleration actions. And again, that's fairly individualised based on each player and what their sort of actual capacity within that is. Another one here we look at is player load, and also number of repeated high intensity efforts could be a factor you've got to consideration. Also, just within the data you're collecting is how you're setting out your GPS threshold. So are you collecting absolute metrics on your speed bands, or are you collecting relative to the individual? So that's something to be factored in. At the moment, we tend to use relative speed bands just to make the whole process a little bit more individualised within our squad. So yeah, one thing we want to sort of focus on today is just the modifiable risk factors that we can look at, both within the prevention process but also the rehab process. And obviously way to do that with our fit players or with our squad is through trying to get your weekly periodisation as best as you can within the process. Your monthly periodisation, so again through the research we can see periods of 3 weeks or more of high load can increase the risk of injury. So from a loading point of view over a 4-week cycle, ideally preferentially would be to have, if you've got 3 weeks of high load, maybe to have some subsequent 1 week deload or reduction in load period in there. And then another factor to consider in when you're working with a squad is the match exposure. So with any group of players, you'll tend to have a group that play week in, week out, your core players, and their sort of load manages itself. So do we need to then mitigate their load through the training week or reduce their load? You've generally got a group of players that are sort of part players that are in and out of the team, and their load sort of can fluctuate quite a lot. And then we've got players in the squad that have probably played minimal minutes all season. So how do we manage their loads across the squad and individualise their training loads to minimise the risk? Again, acute chronics in there. And then obviously just your key principles across the season, or microcycle, mesocycle of your progressive overload, just to avoid any spikes in there. So this is a microcycle that we tend to use. I don't think there's any right or wrong. We've tried different cycles within the squads. At different clubs I've used different methods. I generally don't think there's a right or wrong method in terms of like your weekly loading. This graph here is basically a percentage of match load, so it's a bit of an arbitrary figure just in regards to our sort of loading days. So at the moment, Monday would be generally a light day, particularly for the starting players, active recovery. Tuesday would be a high load day, probably looking anywhere between 60 to 70% of like a match load, with a recovery day on the Wednesday. And then building into Saturday's match day, we'll have a little bit of a taper period. So Thursday would be more of a tactical day, moderate load, and then Friday quite a light load, tapering into the game on a Saturday. Through mesocycles, as I said, again, from an ideal point of view in terms of mitigating risk of injury, a 3-to-1 ratio, so a 3-week progressive overload with a 1-week deload. In the reality, it's never going to look like that working in professional sport. You may be able to create something like that in your off-season or your pre-season phase, but once the season kicks in, it's very hard to manage those sort of weekly cycles. It may end up looking something like this, where your load's a little bit all over the place, depending on training systems, coaches' inputs, games, all other factors to consider. But I think the key principle is that if you know you're going to have a period of high intensity work, somewhere trying to have like an unload or a deload week in there to try and minimise that risk. These are sort of loads that we look at across either a week or a cycle. So we tend to categorise based on distances of each key metric of what we deem as like a low, medium, high or very high week. So we can see generally a deload week, so the key metrics there, sort of below 20k, below 70 metres a minute in your intensity, 1,000 metres high speed running, explosive 1,000, minimal sprint distance, and below sort of 85% of max velocity. That would look like a fairly light week for a player within our squad. Again, this will look different in different teams, different squads. This was just taken on the average sample from our squad. Some players will be higher, some players will be lower, obviously, but it's just a good way to categorise it. And I think moving forward to try and build on this, we'll try and make this more individualised to each player based on their normative loading values. Again, high week could be anything, or very high week, above sort of 30k, 90 metres a minute intensity, above 2,000 metres high speed running explosive. Because we use relative distances, our speed band, you'll see our sprint distance is quite low compared to maybe looking at absolute measures. But generally, if we see above 150 metres a week sprint distance for our squad, that'd be fairly high. And then above 95% max velocity. So we just put this in really to highlight in regards to our periodisation, how we'd use those loads to sort of manage those weeks. But in regards to moving forward, looking at the rehab process, using this as a bit of a framework of getting players back to where they need to be or what's normative within the squad. So when it comes to actually, we do get injuries. When we have an injury, we normally sit down as part of a sort of multidisciplinary team with physios, sports science, medical, everyone involved, and we'll discuss obviously the nature of the injury and then what we need to do to get that player back to play. So first thing we need to consider is the type, location, and severity of the injury. So is it a muscle injury? Is it a tendon issue? Is it joint injury? What's the location? So is it hamstring or quad? And then how severe is that? So is it a grade 1, something that's going to keep them out for 2 to 3 weeks? Or is it a grade 3, which we're going to present on my case study, something that might be a 10 to 12 week injury? Obviously that's going to mould your plan and your framework of your rehab. The key thing here, what's the cause of the injury? So again, I said we're going to use a sprinting injury as an example, but was it a kicking related injury? Was it a sprinting related injury? Was it contact, non-contact, for example? And again, I think when it comes back to your rehab plan, looking at that etiology of the injury or the cause is going to come back into certain things you might need to include or achieve within your rehab process to sort of replicate that injury. Individual considerations, how long the injury is going to be. And then from our point of view, we generally take a back to front approach with a plan. So we need to sort of start with our endpoint of where the player needs to be in 4, 6, 8 weeks, put our targets in place. So what are our rehab targets? What are our sort of physical goals we want them to achieve? And then put the plan in back from that. And then also establishing those return to training markers. This is done through daily, weekly, monthly, and end targets. And then what we try and do within our rehab process is follow the normal, as much as possible within the rehab, follow our normal sort of loading cycle that the squad will be following. Again, just trying to keep consistency and continuity within that, rather than adding in an additional change in load, change in stimulus within the injury. Also, when you're loading on the pitch and you're looking at your GPS metrics, important to factor in what additional S&C or rehab loading the player's doing in the gym. Again, normally within the rehab process, players will be loading heavier in the gym than when they're not injured. So again, just be mindful of how that sort of comes into play with your pitch or your rehab loading outside. I think it's key to involve the player within the process. So every player will have their own sort of mental approach and ideas of what they should and shouldn't be doing within the process. And from my experience, I think it's quite useful to bring the player in and from once they're sort of, you've got a plan in place, sit down with the player and sort of discuss the plan and try and get them to buy in and have a bit of input within that. I think that definitely helps and makes the process a little bit smoother. And then just keep that throughout the process. So good communication and monitoring with the player throughout the process. Make sure they're coping with the demands physically and mentally with what you're doing within the plan. Like I said, involve other practitioners if and where possible. So have a multidisciplinary approach. And then obviously consideration to external factors and influences. So examples, you might have your plan in place of where you want the player to be, and it's happened to us on a number of occasions this year where if you've got a player out for 6 to 8 weeks, all of a sudden you've got a key game coming up and the manager wants them back in 4 to 5 weeks. So things can change within the process. So you have to be quite flexible and adaptable within your plan as well. Again, just to highlight sort of the complexity really of the rehab process. Again, I'm not going to read through all this, but just all the risk factors and the considerations we have to give within the process. So here's some of the return to training markers that we tend to use. So we try and use individual targets based on their normative match or training data with regards to deciding what they need to achieve within the process. And then also factor in other things like the injury, the mechanism, severity, for example, and other gym-based markers that we want them to achieve. So across the in-session, so these are some of the targets that we've used. And again, if you look at the research, I think there's big gaps out there and it's difficult to find definitive targets based on GPS metrics. This is something we've sort of built internally and as part of our process. Whether it's right or wrong, I'll let you make your own mind up, but it's just what we found's worked quite well for us. So in session, we're looking for them to get 70% of a match load. So this would replicate probably our higher training load day on a Tuesday. Above 80% of match load in regards to distance per minute, 80% high speed running distance, explosive distance and sprint distance. Again, injury specific, so generally above 90% of max velocity, although if it was a hamstring injury that occurred running at higher speeds than that, we would want a player to achieve those higher speeds before we put them back into play. And again, 80% of their accel, decel intensities. Weekly targets, so we look at, again, Dave's responsibility for looking at sort of what a player would normally achieve across a training week, and then we try and achieve certain percentages of that across a week, and then have multiple exposures, if for example it's a hamstring injury, before we put them back in. So this is a little example of some of the markers that we use. So we've got some of our sort of gym-based markers here on the right that we look at in relation to the pitch loads here. So see we've got a total distance, high speed running, sprint distance, velocities and explosive distance. What the target was in the rehab, and then just almost like a little tick box when the players achieve those markers. So with this player, we got into a point where he'd hit all his gym-based markers that we wanted to achieve, hit all his pitch-based markers, so we was in a position to sign him off, put him back into training in a position where we feel that he was physically able to cope. This was an example of like sort of mesocycle really in terms of his loading pattern. So early stage injury, so the first week of his sort of pitch rehab all the way through to sort of his end stage rehab. Again, not going to talk loads of detail. You can sort of see for yourself sort of like how that progressed and the loading cycles that we used. And then here sort of from a periodization point of view, what his weekly planned totals were across those GPS markers. So again, just looking at this one, total distance, high speed, sprint, explosive and max velocity, and then sort of how that sort of planned and progressed through the week. Like I said, we try and follow a similar cycle to the squad. So Monday would generally be an intensive day, Tuesday extensive, Wednesday recovery day, Thursday a bit of a technical, tactical, a light one on a Friday, and then a big sort of load day on a Saturday. So again, we try and replicate what they would do as a normal training week. Obviously that would progressively increase over the weeks of their rehab before they obviously signed off, return back to play. This will just look at some of the GPS markers and sort of what that would look like, how we'd monitor that across time. So this is a day-to-day or daily report of obviously, again, we've got our total distance, explosive distance, accels and decels. And then also I said this key one here is that sort of magnitude of accelerations and decelerations. And hopefully you can see on the next slide, a bit of a progression across the weeks, just in regards to not so much volume, but the more higher intensity metrics. So your explosiveness, high speed running and sprint, you can see it's fairly linear in terms of the progression there in the rehab process. And the same with those sort of magnitude of accels and decels there. Just in regards to a little case study, I don't know if he's going to play, but so this was a hamstring injury that occurred. So as you can see, this player here has just walked off. Very, very innocuous hamstring injury, turned into be a grade 3C. So the player's literally just planted within the session, a little bit off balance, grade 3C hamstring injury. So when we sat down as a department, we sort of looked at this and thought, well, how's this happened? Like literally he's not hardly doing anything. So I think this is again where it comes back to the etiology of the injury and looking historically at some of his training loads prior to this injury happening. So again, this is a bit of data that we collected on this player. So funny enough, this was a player that we took on loan in January. So he'd been at another club from obviously the rest of the season, hadn't had much game exposure, had previous hamstring injuries within that season as well. So the information that's highlighted in the green was data from his previous club that we've implemented in, and then from outside of that data that we'd sort of picked up ourselves from when he was training with us. So you can see prior to coming to us, so this slide here, up to this point, he got injured. He was out with a small hamstring injury, grade 1. He sort of had this accelerated rehab at his parent club before signing with us. So he had fairly high, this is his sprint exposure, fairly high levels of sprint exposure prior to coming to us. Again, and then once arriving with us, fairly high frequency and volume of sprint distance. So when we looked at, what's possibly caused this injury, we don't think it was the mechanism of what actually happened in that small-sided game. I think it was a combination of factors within the player, but also this ratio or high load of sprint exposure that we saw sort of leading into the injury. So for that player, low chronic overall training load and match exposure. And then we had this high acute sprint exposure and accumulated sprint volume, probably the weeks preceding the injury. He'd had 2 previous hamstring injuries. So when we talk about risk factors, obviously these are non-modifiable from our point of view. We had strength tested the players and he had really good levels of isometric and eccentric strength. So that wasn't a particular concern, but he did have these injuries previously. Probably had a bit of an accelerated end stage rehab at his parent club prior to signing for us. And it's always one that we see in football. If you sign a player in January, quite often the case where they haven't been playing much games, they haven't had as much training load, may have been in a bomb squad a little bit. So their motivation levels, their training intensity's probably dropped off. Higher risk of injury coming in, step up in intensity or demand in their new club. older player, so again, naturally higher risk. And I said external factors obviously to factor in as well, change of club, relocation, any emotional stress with the signing that's going on, potential changes in lifestyle and habits. So when we looked at this injury and designing a sort of rehab plan, these are the sort of factors we had to take in consideration in regards to not just what his GPS loads were going to look like on the pitch. So when we planned out his sort of rehab process, again, this was more of a medical driven sort of part of the process that sort of feeding back. So we just planned out it was probably going to be a predicted 10-week injury. And then sort of how do we want to sort of progress his loads or his gym loads or his markers across those 10 weeks. So again, we've got things down the side. So his acute management, isometric loading, movement patterns, strength and capacity. And then more importantly, from a GPS point of view, like his return to running markers and how we progress his speeds across the weeks, eccentric loading, and then I said just progressing down his intensity of his running to the point of getting him back up sort of week 9 or 10 to hitting sort of maximal speeds, as long as he had the sort of strength to do so. So this again, a little bit of an overview of like a week for him. So yeah, you can see a bit of a funny week because we had the Tuesday, I think we had a game, so he was set remote work, but this is sort of how his week looked. So we ended up having a higher load day on the Monday, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday building up to a bit of like a sign-off session. Again, because he was a hamstring injury, wanted to hit multiple or sort of repeated efforts above 95% within a week. Again, that's what he's likely to do when he comes back. And again, just looking at his sort of target metrics across the week. And then whether he hit his pitch markers or not. So based on the percentages of what we felt he needed to do within his rehab, sort of whether he achieved those markers or not. So did he hit these within a session? Were we happy to then sign him off back into play or back to training? And then just some of the gym markers we used in combination with that. So again, looking at his sort of like hamstring strength. Again, some of the work Chris there, looking at his sort of jump scores and his power and his asymmetry there. Some groin bar work, looking at his sort of adductor strength, and then some isometric handheld dynamometry and endurance work. So again, with this player, got to a point a bit earlier than planned. I think he was 8 or 9 weeks into the rehab process where he'd sort of achieved all these markers, giving us enough confidence to say, look, yeah, we're happy with this player. We're going to drop him back into training. So just based off of that, so just some key messages. So as I've said throughout the process, injuries are multifactorial, and as much as training load is a massive and important measure of that and can obviously predict or increase the risk of injury, I think we have to factor in a lot of those other risk factors when it comes to the rehab process and what other factors can we modify as well as their training loads. We know that inappropriate training loads, so too much or too little, is going to put a player at risk of injury, and that we need to understand the cause or the mechanism of the injury when designing your rehab plan and try and set your targets based off the individual demands or requirements of the player. Like I said, we take a back to front approach, so sort of B to A approach, so where do we want the player to get to by week 8, week 10, and then fill in the gaps working backwards. So what does that start point then end up looking like, and how quickly can you progress the player sort of through those processes? Try and take a multidisciplinary approach where possible, and ultimately, you know, once you've got your plan there, don't be too rigid with your plan. It's got to be flexible, adaptable. So there's multiple things that can change your plan along the way. It could be how the player's responding, how the player's feeling. It could be external factors, say the manager wanting the player back a little bit earlier than planned. It could be the player pushing the process a little bit harder to try and get back sooner. It might be the player putting the brakes on because he doesn't want to get back sooner. So there's hundreds of things you've got to factor in, and don't get too caught up in making sure you're always hitting the numbers. Just use them there as a bit of a guideline or a framework sort of to work within. And more importantly, just probably apply a common sense approach to your loading patterns really. So I apologise, a lot of slides there, quite a lot of information to sort of cram in. It's a little bit less scientific and research based than Chris's presentation, but just a little bit of an overview of like how we apply sort of GPS within our squad, and then from like a rehab point of view, trying to get a player back to full fitness. And then just a few references from some of the research that sort of used within that.
Thank you very much.
There you go.
Any questions for Laurence? We've time for maybe one or two questions.
Go on, Dave, you must have one.
Hi, mate.
Hi.
Just the individualised thresholds. What do you use? Like, is it percentage of peak speed or
In regards to our bands?
Yes.
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll take a max velocity for each player, whether that's through games or whether that's through tests that we've done or whatever their peak. We normally take it off 3, so whatever their 3 max is, and take the average of those. And then we'll set off speed bands off of that. So our high speed running bands start at 60%. So 60% of their maximal speed. So then we have 3 high speed running bands, 60 to 69, 70, 79, 80 to 85, and then 86% plus is sprint. So that's how we'll sort of individualise the bands off of those. But in terms of individualisation of the training load, that'll be taken off of normative game data or normative training week data that we've got for the players.
Hi Laurence, thanks
Hi.
for the chat.
No worries.
You've got your loading continuum.
Yeah.
And something we always struggle with is, so you've got an X amount of meters over 90% to hit, for example.
Yeah.
How do you deal with differences in density of how that metric is hit? So for example, you might hit your target of 50 meters above 80%, for example.
Yeah.
But if all 50 meters are done in a 1 minute period
Yeah.
versus over a 80-minute period,
Yeah.
physiologically it's a different effect.
Of course it is, yeah.
We struggle with this, so
Yeah.
I'm just wondering where you guys sit on this.
Are you talking about in terms of rehab or from a training point of view?
Anything.
I think obviously when it comes to training, it's a lot more difficult to control because there's a lot more input from our external people, AA manager, coaches. So I think that comes down to relationship with the coaches and probably developing your own sort of like drill database. So looking at maybe specific drills within a session. So we've got a few drills, for example, on a Tuesday that we've banked that we know, right, if we do this drill, the majority of players in this drill are going to hit, I don't know, 110 meters a second for a 5-minute block. So then you can periodise, obviously, right, we're going to do 4 blocks of that today because we want 20 minutes of that intensity. I think same within your rehab, obviously, it's just being creative and coming up with drills that are going to hit those metrics. Again, what I find works quite well, because I know what you mean there with like the high speed running. So for example, if you're getting them doing 8 box to boxes, for example, with minimal recovery, the density there of your high speed running is through the roof. So sometimes to like superset. So what we do is you might do a high speed run and then come back in and do some like technical work or maybe a bit more of an intensive drill and then back out and to do some like high speed running. So that can work quite well in terms of just managing that density of overloading one metric. They're quite effective. But I think, yeah, developing a drill database yourself of, actually understanding what drills sort of hit what metrics and then being able to sort of pull those drills out when you need to use them to target certain sort of components, really. Does that answer your question? Or?
That's perfect.
Yeah. Anything else?
We're good. You can catch Laurence.